Thank you to everybody for joining. In the late 13th century, the Rashba received a very strange question from the Jews of Sicily. We actually only have the text of his answer, but it's clear from we don't have the text of the question, but we only have the text of the answer. But it's clear from his answer that the question that the Jews of Sicily were asking him was in regards to the permissibility of saying Chazarat HaShatz by Arvit. And we don't have the exact circumstances or the exact text, but it seems that the Jews in the 13th century in Italy, from the answer the Rashba gives, it's clear that somebody in Sicily in the late 1200s was praying Arvit with Chazarat HaShatz. And the Rashba answers that no, one cannot say Chazarat HaShatz for Arvit. We paskin in the Gemara, as we're going to see soon, that Arvit is a reshut, meaning it is not an obligation. And because it is not an obligation, the Shliach Tzibur has nothing to fulfill you with. There's no reason for a Chazarat HaShatz. Classically speaking, a Chazarah exists so that you could fulfill the obligation for people who don't know how to read it themselves. But because there is no chova, there's no obligation, therefore we don't have a Chazarah. For this reason, the Rashba paskins that we do not do Chazarat HaShatz for Arvit. But what were the circumstances of such a question? We don't really know much about the Jews of Sicily. We don't know who they were, where they were from. It's possible that these Jews who came to Sicily were coming from the Mugrab. It could be that they came from Northern Africa. It could be that they were coming from Spain. The Spanish Jews had quite a presence in Sicily for a few hundred years. It could be they were there from Germany. It could be they were there from Italy. We just don't know. And we also don't know the circumstances of the question. But just the fact that the question was asked to the Rashba tells us definitely that somebody, for some reason, in Sicily in the late 1200s was reciting the Arvit with Chazarat HaShatz. And that's what I want to delve in tonight in order to illuminate our understanding of the early history of Arvit, how Arvit developed from the earliest times of the Beit HaMikdash all the way until much later times, up until this day. I will also mention that besides the Rashba's strong wording, the Rambam also has clearly strong wording against such a practice. The Rambam says, "Ve'eno chozer lehitpalel b'kol ram ba'arvit, lefi she'en tfilat arvit chova, lefichach lo yivarech brachot levatala." Person should not say brachot levatala, null brachot. She'en kan adam she'itchayev behem kedei lo tzil yidei chovato. You have nobody to be motzi, and therefore there is no reason to say Chazarat HaShatz. The Rambam uses very strong wording against such a practice, which might hint that he himself witnessed such a practice. Okay, so let's rewind the clock much further back to the time of the Rambam, further back to the time of the Rash, but let's go back to the time of the Beis HaMikdash. In Yerushalayim at night, the Beit HaMikdash was closed. Okay, so before the Mishnah was written, hundreds of years before, in the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, the Beit HaMikdash had no services at night. I'm sorry. 1 second. Give me 1 second just to deal with a technical issue. As the Gemara mentions, there were avarim, extra parts of the animals that were left on the mizbeach overnight, but there were no actual services done. The gates of the Beit HaMikdash were closed. There were no kohanim inside of the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore there were no corresponding prayers, as far as we know, that were done in or outside of the Beit HaMikdash. We just have no information from any source, be it Jewish, be it non-Jewish, internal or external, to the Jewish circles, that ever gives us an idea of a tefillah like Arvit, a nighttime, specifically nighttime prayer in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. For this, we have no evidence. We just have no information to suggest that there were Jewish people praying an official nighttime prayer in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. It's not until we get to the Mishnah when we find a hint that such a practice might have existed either during the second Beit HaMikdash, at the end of it, or after. Because the Mishnah says as follows, Tefilat ha'erev ein lakeva. This is the fourth parak in Brachot. And the Mishnah is listing all the different times that are allowed for each prayer, like until when you could say each prayer. And it ends with Tefilat ha'erev ein lakeva. It calls this not Arvit, not Ma'ariv. Tefilat ha'erev has no fixed something, has no fixity. So the Gemara struggles to understand, what does it mean en lakeva? The simple meaning would mean, okay, you could just say it as long as you want. The Gemara says, "My ein lakeva." What is ein lakeva? If it means to say that if you want, you could pray all night, and it doesn't have any end time, it should just say tfilat ha'erev kol halayla. So what must it mean? Elamai ein lakeva kiman damar tfilat arvit reshut. It must mean that it has no fixed institution, not no fixed time, meaning that it is really an optional prayer. Amar Bihud Amar Shmuel, Tefilat Arvit, Rabbi Gamliel Amar Chovar, Rabbi Yeshua Amar Reshut. It brings a brisa from Bihud Amar Shmuel that there was a machloket Tanaim, there was a disagreement among the great Tanaim in Yavne, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Gamliel held it was obligatory, and Rabbi Yeshua held it was optional. Amar Abai Halacha Kedivei Amar Chova, Rava Amar Halacha Kedivei Amar Reshut. Abai paskin that it's a Chova, Rava paskin that it is a Reshut. Now, the Gemara goes on to tell a long, fascinating story. And I'm not going to read it here in Hebrew, but in Aramaic, but I will summarize basically what happens. What happens is a Talmud comes to Yeshua during the reign of Rabbi Gamliel Hanasi in Yavne, and he says to him, what is the halachas? Do you have to pray Arvit? Is it a chiyuv or is it a reshut? And Rabbi Yeshua says it is a reshut. The Talmud goes to Rabbi Gamliel, and Rabbi Gamliel says it's a chovah. So he says, Rabbi Yeshua told me it was a reshut. He says, let's wait until all the rabbis come back to the study hall, and I'll ask in public. He asks in public, is Ma'ariv a reshut or a chayva? Everybody, is there anybody who holds that it is a reshut? Nobody answers. He says, Rabbi Yeshua, people, I was told that he makes him stand up, and he says, I was told that you, paskind, is it true that anybody here holds that it is a chova, that it is a reshut? He says, no, everyone holds it's a chova. He says, why are you lying to me? Somebody just told me that you said that it's a reshut. And he admitted, yes, you're right, I did say that. And as in an act of almost punishment, Rabbi Gamliel didn't give him permission to sit down, and he continued the shiur. Because Rabbi Yeshua was such a man of such incredible stature, the community became, the people in the study hall were very agitated by this. Rabbi Yeshua was forced to remain standing, and they stopped the shiur, and they got upset at Rabbi Gamliel because this was the third incident where Rabbi Gamliel had troubled Rabbi Yeshua, and they decided to depose Rabbi Gamliel as the Nasi, as the president of the Jewish people. And instead, they went to go elect Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah took the position temporarily, and the study hall politics were changed because essentially Rabbi Gamliel never let weaker people into the Beit HaMidrash, and Elazar ben Azariah allowed weaker people into Beit HaMidrash. Eventually, and Rabbi Gamliel, by the way, the whole time, it wasn't like a bitter fight. It was only about Torah. So Rabbi Gamliel stayed in the Beit HaMidrash, and he continued to learn with people. He continued to stay even when Rabbi Yeshua was there. It's a fascinating, there are fascinating demonstrations of who these people were. And then Rabbi Gamliel decided that he must have insulted Rabbi Yeshua. What he did must have been wrong. So he went to Rabbi Yeshua's house to apologize to him. He apologizes to him, to make a long story short. And now everybody wanted to reinstate Rabbi Gamliel as the Nasi. And what happens is that they basically make it a 3 weeks. Rabbi Gamliel gives shiur, and 1 week Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah gives shiur. So they both had the title of Nasi. Now, this entire story only gives us the politics of power in Yavne. It's a fascinating lens into the stature of these great people, and to see how everything they did was l'shem shemayim, how none of it was for their own kavod, and even in their most bitter fights, they maintained and set their priorities according to what they thought was most important. Rabbi Gamliel believed that he believed strongly that Klal Yisrael needed a strong leader, and that everybody needed to be unified around one psak. And therefore, he was very forceful about enforcing his psakim, about enforcing his rules. But although this tells us a lot about this debate politically, it doesn't tell us anything about the debate historically, because we have no information about what exactly this debate is all about. There's no question. They're not arguing back and forth who began the practice of doing Arvit. Why do we have to do Arvit? What are the considerations? Pro or con? Should I do Arvit? Should I not do Arvit? What are the pros and cons? What are the arguments for and arguments against? None of that is discussed. There's taken this vague institution that the Chacham and Yavna seem to have known, which is that people have to pray 3 times a day. And that institution is assumed to already exist. Not that Rabbi Gamliel created it ex nihilo, something from nothing. Rather, there must have been some sort of pre-existing practice, pre-existing understanding in Yavna that people have to pray 3 times a day. And they were just legislating pre-existing practice into law. What and how forceful is the law of saying Arvit? But nothing in this debate tells us about the arguments for or arguments against saying Arvit, which is very, very perplexing. It must be that, Rabbi Gamliel was not instituting the 3 tefillot every day, something from nothing. It must be that there was a pre-existing practice. Otherwise, if Rabbi Gamliel is inventing it here and now, you made the rule, you make the rules. Like, if you invented this, you should be making the rules. You wouldn't have to have an argument about this. It's simply your if it's your invention, you make the rules. It must be something else was happening here. And even stranger, this debate lasted for a very long time, because although I read the nusach, the Vilna nusach of the Gemara here, the truth is that the older versions of Shas mention not just Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamliel, but they also mention Rav and Shmuel, and they mention, of course, Abai and Rava. So that's 3 generations. You go all the way from Yavna in the 100s, in the 2nd century, all the way to the end of the 3rd century with Rav and Shmuel, all the way to the end of the 4th century with Abai and Rava. Over hundreds of years, this machloket, this dispute, never was resolved. It seems that everybody, that Klal Yisrael was still split over these 3 generations as to whether or not Arvit was a chovah, or if Arvit was a reshut. Was a person obligated to say it, or was it optional? Now, for the most part, the Gemara in Bavli and the Gemara in Yerushalmi seem to settle the maskana that it is a reshut. They seem to paskin at the end of the day, like Rav and like Rava and like Rabbi Yeshua, that Arvit is a reshut. For example, the Gemara on Shabbat says that if a person, I think Zeiri says that if the Babylonians have this custom that if a person already took off his belt at night to go to sleep, after his meal, then we don't force him to go say Arvit. Meaning, if he didn't have any intention to pray, he took off his belt and he already was going to go to bed, we're not going to stop him and say, oh, you forgot to pray Arvit. We have another Gemara with Rebbe and Rabbi Chia, who are from Eretz Yisrael. And they used to say at the end of their shiur, whoever's going to pray Arvit, make sure to pray before it gets too dark outside. Meaning that they were allowing people to pray Arvit earlier because the timing is more flexible. Since Arvit is a reshut, and because we say in lakeva, you could sometimes, at least b'diavad, according to the Bavli, one could say Arvit even when it's still light outside and still be yotzei. And they wanted people to do it before they fell asleep. So we do see that even though it was a reshut, some people still did it, but it was clearly the majority opinion in Bavel, for sure, was that it was a reshut. That's what it seems, but it's again a little bit murky. And this murkiness was confusing to the Rishonim, because there are certain sugyot in Shas where it seems that the Gemara takes for granted that it is a chovah, and there are some sugyot where it takes for granted that it is a reshut. For example, how could the Chachamim make a takana that you have to say Havdalah by Arvit if Arvit is optional? How could you say that you have to be somech Dula L'tefillah, if Arvit is optional. Why would you have to do that? Why do you have to do anything by Arvit? It's completely optional. Or how could you say a tefilat hashlama? How could you do a compensatory prayer if you missed Arvit? Why would you make it up by Shachrit? I thought it was optional. It must be, it's a chovah. Or you could say, why couldn't Ne'ilah be motzi Arvit? There's all sorts of different problems around Shas about where the Gemara sometimes sounds like Arvit is considered a reshut, and sometimes the Gemara sounds like it believes Arvit is a chovah. And there are many different solutions have been offered for this. Some more confusing than others. The Balei Tosafot seems to have a very confusing way of dealing with this. But the discussion actually begins earlier than the Rishonim. Rav Shira Gaon was asked this, and the questioners had a more interesting take on it. Besides telling him that they saw a stira on different sugyot and shas, they also had a very interesting question in the Mahalach HaPsak. Like let's say we passing like Rav, we passing like Rava, which is the way we probably should do it, right? That's what they assumed. They said, since when do we paskin one way and have a minhag the other way? If we paskin that Arvit is a reshut, then why in the world do we have a minhag to do it like a chovah? And if the minhag is to do it, why does everybody say Arvit? And if everybody says Arvit, you should also, if it's treated like a chovah, if it's a real chovah, then you should have Chazarat HaShatz. So what's going on here? So Rav Shir Gaon has a very interesting take on this. And he says, everybody, or Bishua, Gamliel, Rava, Baya, Rav, Shmuel, everybody agrees that Arvit is a mitzvah. Meaning, just like there are many mitzvot in the Torah, Arvit is also a mitzvah. But there are different types of mitzvot, asay. There are mitzvot asay that you must do and you have to do, and if you don't do it, you're in trouble. You get punishment. And the mitzvot asay that you could do that are optional. For example, giving tzedakah, doing gemilut chasadim. Those are optional mitzvot, right? You don't have to do them. When you have the opportunity, you can do them and you get schar. But doing tefillin, lulav, sukkah, matzah, and pesach, these are things that if you don't do them, you get an onesh. Why is it called a chovah? Why is an obligation called a chovah? Because you have a chov, you have a debt to pay. There will be a debt to pay. There will be a punishment if you don't do them. He says everybody agrees that Arvit is a mitzvah. The question is, will you get punished for not doing it? Is it actually a chovah as well? And therefore, he says this answers up all the sugot in Shas. Some held that it was a mitzvah with a chovah. Some held it was a mitzvah that was only b'torat reshut. Once you agree it's a mitzvah, then you could do a compensatory prayer. You could also do a hashlama for it. You could also do somech kula tefillah, and this answers all the problems in his view. That's a very interesting take. However, because it's just a mitzvah, you do have to admit, if you're of Shir Gaon, that we're still leaving out Chazarah, Kiddusha, giving it an exactly fixed zman. There are distinctions whether or not it's a chovah or a reshut, even according to Rav Shir Gaon, but one has to iron out the particulars for each view. Rabbeinu Hananel is brought also. Rabbeinu Hananel is a little bit later than Rav Shir Gaon. He formulates it a little differently. He says, no, this is the answer. He says that even Rabbi Yeshua agrees, meaning Rabbi Yeshua and Gamliel are arguing whether it's a reshut or a chovah. But even Rabbi Yeshua would agree that in a place where they have the minhag to say Arvit, for them, it is a shiur. For them, it is a chovah. It depends on the place. It's minhag hamakom. And that's why Rabbi Yeshua was able to lie. He wasn't lying. In Rabbi Gamliel's place, in Yavne, when Gamliel was Nasi, because that place has the minhag to make it a chovah, it was a chovah in that place. So he wasn't lying when he said that everybody when he said that no, everybody here holds it's a chovah, because that was the truth. It depends on minhag hamakom. A little bit later, you find the Bahag. Not later, I would say in roughly the same era. You have the Bahag and Rav Hai Gaon, who have a very interesting take. The Bahag says that if a person davened already, he accepted upon himself Arvit as a chovah. Meaning, let's say you already prayed Arvit, but you forgot to say something inside Arvit, right? Or, let's say you prayed Arvit already, and you said, instead of saying the Arvit for Shabbat, you said the Arvit of Chol, or vice versa. Once you prayed, you're showing that for you it's a chovah, therefore you have to go back. Meaning, that true, we paskin it's a reshut, but if a person prayed it already, it's as if he accepted it upon himself as if it is a chovah. Rav Hai Gaon was misinterpreted. I believe he was misinterpreted later to be saying that if a person prays Arvit one time in his life, it's as if he accepted it as a chovah for his entire life. I don't think that's what Hai Gaon was saying. I think he means retroactively. If a person davened Arvit, then or if let's say he didn't take off his belt and he went to the shul to daven, he's already showing his intent as if he's accepting upon himself as if it is a chovah. I don't think it's mistaber that doing it one time in your life makes it as if it's a chovah forever. The Rif and the Rambam, however, say this is indeed a little later, 100 years later. The Rif and the Rambam say that by their time, everybody in Klal Yisrael accepted it as a chovah. As the questioners for shiur go and say the same thing. Everybody in Klal Yisrael prays Arvit. How is this a reshut? The Rif and Rambam say, well, it's a reshut, but our minhag is to treat it like a chovah. The Raviyah, who's Rabbi Elazar ben Yoel, one of the Chachmei Ashkenaz, has a very interesting resolution to this debate, which is what's going to continue this shiur. His resolution is how is it that we have some Gemaras that say it is a chovah, some Gemaras that seem to say it's a reshut. Why do we have conflicting Gemaras? The Raviyah has a very interesting answer. He says the only time Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel argue by Arvit is by Arvit Shel Chol, but by Arvit Shel Chagim and by Shabbat and Yom Tov for the Chagim, everybody agrees that it is a chovah. So take an Arvit like Leil Shabbat, that's a chovah. That's where you have to be Somech Hula L'Tzifilah, or Motzei Shabbat even perhaps would be considered a chovah. Therefore, you have to put Havdalah in there. Anytime that it is attached to a Shabbat or a Yom Tov, that's when it's a chovah. And for that reason, you have varying you have different sugyot which seem to have different conclusions, like by Yom Kippur and the like. So everybody agrees that it is a chovah by Yom Tov and the Chag, and he doesn't pull it out of thin air. He doesn't just make that up. First of all, he wants to show that that's what the Yerushalmi and the Bavli seem to say. He tries to prove it from different conclusions of the different Gemara. But more importantly, he quotes something that's really interesting that I don't know if we'll have time to talk about tonight. But there's something called Sefer HaYerushalmi. There's a scholar, I think his name is something Zusman. Let me find the name. I'm sorry. His name is here we go. Yaakov Sussman, who looked into this about 30 years ago. There's a sefer that the Chachmei Ashkenaz had and the Bali Tosfot had that they call the Sefer HaYerushalmi. It's essentially a large codex that they seem to have had, which was partially Talmud Yerushalmi and partially other interpolations. And it seems to be that it was like a modified or corrupted version of the Yerushalmi, where a lot of Bavli things were added to reconcile the Yerushalmi and make it make sense to them. However, in his version of the Yerushalmi, it seems to say that there was a compromise. Early on, there was a compromise in the time of Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel. They compromised that we'll hold that as a reshut, but we won't do a Chazarat HaShatz, and we won't do a Kedusha. So Professor Yisrael Tashima, in his study of Arvit, whether or not it's reshut or chovah, he believes that this is early evidence that this machloket goes back to early Eretz Yisrael, and this Sefer Yerushalmi is a good source. Personally, I don't know if it's really a good source. It could be that it's later scribes who corrupted it, but even if you say that it is a real version, it is a real Talmud Yerushalmi, still that is only from the Amoraim telling you that early on there was a compromise that it should be treated in some manners like a chovah and in some manners like a reshut, and this compromise goes much further back than just the time of the later Geonim. Now, let's get back to our original question about the Jews of Sicily and saying Chazarat HaShatz by Arvit. As far as we know, there should be no reason, since all of the poskim seem to say that we do not do Chazarat HaShatz by Arvit, and we treat it like a reshut in that manner. There should be no reason or no evidence for us seeing anybody doing this. But yet here we have evidence for people actually doing Chazarat HaShatz by Arvit. So in order to understand this, you need some background in ancient piyut. In the time of the classical Paitanim, the 500s and the 600s, there were the great early Paitanim in Eretz Yisrael, like Rabbi Lazar Kalir and Yanai. There were poets who were writing Paitanim, who wrote substitute Shmona Esreis in poetic form, right? These are the earliest piyutim. They're called krovot. And there are many, many different types of krovot. Let's say it was a special Shabbat, a special holiday. If the Shmona Esrei had a kedusha inside of it, like shachrit of Shabbat, then they would create a special replacement for Chazarat HaShatz that the Chazan would say. So instead of doing a regular Chazarat HaShatz, the Chazan would get up and say a poetic version of Chazarat HaShatz. That was called a kedusha. But in ancient Eretz Yisrael, not ancient, but in medieval Eretz Yisrael, in the 500s, 600s, 700s, they only did kedusha on Shabbat by shachrit. A few hundred years later, they began adding kedusha to mincha and musaf as well. But it was kedusha the entire week was only by Shabbat on shachrit. They would never do it during the week. And therefore, the other Shmona Esreis on Shabbat or Yom Tov did not have a kedusha. In that situation, they would write a piyut called a shivata. A shivata comes from the word seven, right? There are 7 brachot in a Shabbat or a Chag Shmona Esrei. And this poem was meant to replace the standard Shmona Esrei. It was going to be a modified Shmona Esrei in poetic form. We have dozens of shivatot for Arvit and for Musaf. For Minhag, it doesn't seem that anybody ever wrote shivatot, simply because Minhag wasn't one of the more special prayers. By Arvit, usually it's like the first prayer of the Chag. Musaf is like the quintessential prayer of the Chag. But Minhag seems to have been one where they just let it go. Arvit and Musaf are cases where there are many piyutim called a shivata. And what that tells us without a shadow of a doubt is that in Eretz Yisrael, in the 500s, 600s, there were people doing Chazarat HaShatz for Arvit, at the very least on the Chagim and Shabbat. Why they did this, we don't know. Were they doing it because they believed it was a chovah? Were there Jews who did this all week and they held like a Gamliel? Maybe. But maybe their Aviyah is also right. Maybe it's only on Shabbat and Yom Tov, or maybe it was just a poetic embellishment. And we just can't know for sure. We don't know if they really held that it was a chovah. But clearly, from the discoveries that we have in the Cairo Geniza and from all of the reverse engineering that was done by the past 100+ years of scholarship on piyut and especially on the shivatas, it is clear that there was a Chazarat HaShatz by Arvit, if at least a poetic version. Now, Professor Ezra Fleischer was one of the pioneers of this study, and you could obviously buy his book about poetry in the Middle Ages. He has an outstanding parak on the Shivata that could guide you here. And if you're interested, there's another scholar in Eretz Yisrael, Mordechai Akiva Friedman. He's already old by this point. He just won the Israel Prize. He did a very serious study of the Shivatot by Arvit to try to determine how many people were actually doing a Chazarat HaShatz by Arvit. And it's very interesting because what he finds in the Cairo Geniza, he went through the Cairo Geniza, he went and found 2 major Sidurim that were written by Chazanim in the old synagogue, the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat. In Egypt, the Ben Ezra synagogue was where there were people who davened the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael. And the communities who followed the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael were very into the piyutim of Eretz Yisrael. So he found from the 11th century, manuscripts of Sidurim from these Chazanim who were praying with those ancient Nuschaot and those ancient Shivatot, according to their Minhag. Now, you must understand that by the 1100s, the 1000s, 1100s, this is already 500 years later. So there's been a lot of development at this time. But he finds in those manuscripts a lot of clues to what the Shivata must have been originally and what it eventually became. For what the one part, on the one hand, we do realize that originally Shivatot did not have a Kedusha inside of them. Some later authors added a Kedusha into Shivatot when Eretz Yisrael began saying Kedusha by Mincha and Musaf and by Arvit. Possibly by Arvit. I'm not actually sure about that one. Furthermore, we find that some of the Chazanim by Arvit clearly had two parts. So in some of the Sidurim, it'll say that the Chazan will write in his notes, first we say the Lachash, first we say the Quiet Shmona Esrei, and then the Chazan says the repetition, the Chazarah, with this Shivata. So clearly, that was a traditional practice that was done. But it's also not clear if every time they did this. It is possible that at some times they would only do the Shivata out loud and nobody would do a Tefillah B'Lachash. We know, for example, that there's a Minhag Eretz Yisrael in the Sefer Chilufim Minhagim. They have an older Minhag that by the tefillot, which people didn't usually do, like a tefillah of Rosh Hashanah, tefillah of Yom Kippurim, even by the tefillah B'Lachash, the quiet Shmona Esrei, the Chazan would say it aloud, just so that people, a little bit aloud, so that people who didn't know how to say it could follow him and do the quiet Shmona Esrei on their own. And this is a minhag which is still done in the Moroccan shul today. So it's not 100% clear that by every Arvit they did both a Lachash and a Shivata. It's possible that sometimes the Chazan will just do the Shivata. We can't know for sure that they did both. But be that as it may, there's even another Shivata in this collection that he was looking through, where the Chazan wrote in the beginning of the Shmona Esrei, he writes Baruch Atah Hashem, Hey Shin Shin Mem. He doesn't write Yud Yud Yud. He writes Hey Shin Mem, which is very unusual for this scribe, this Chazan. And so the conclusion he comes to, Professor Friedman, is that it must be that because there was pressure from the Bavliim in that city in Cairo, the Bavliim didn't like that the shul that was Nusach Eretz Yisrael was doing what they considered a bracha levatala. The whole Shabbat, the whole Chazarat HaShatz in their view was a bracha levatala. And he believes that it's from their pressure that he said Baruch Atah Hashem instead of Baruch Atah with the Shem Malchut Beferush. Very, very interesting clue. And it would seem that this is what the Rambam was referring to, that the Rambam must have seen in his time in Cairo Jews who did a Chazarat HaShatz for Arvit, even the poetic one, and he considered that a bracha levatala. How could a person say Chazarat HaShatz for Arvit? And because of the pressure of these major poskim like the Rambam, this Chazan, instead of saying Baruch Atah Hashem b'Shem u'Malchut, he would say Baruch Atah Hashem Heishin Mem. This is a very interesting theory, and I think that it's probably very close to the truth. And to summarize and to circle back to the Rashba, it is very likely that what was happening in Sicily is that we had Spanish Jews who were sending a question to the Gadol Hadar. The Rashba was famously the Spanish Gadol Hadar, and it's very possible that there were Spanish Jews in Sicily at the time that were sending a question. We found these Jews here, possibly Mughrabi Jews from Northern Africa, possibly Italian Jews, who are praying Chazarat HaShatz, at least on the Chagim or Shabbat, for Arvit, and they wanted to know if that was permissible. I am convinced, personally, that the Rashba was not answering about Chazarat HaShatz for Arvit b'Yamot HaChol. In my opinion, it is most likely that the Jews in Sicily were doing Chazarat HaShatz for Arvit on Shabbat and Yom Tov with a special Shivata. I can't know that for sure because we don't have the text of the question, but it would appear to me that the Rashba answered that question with the emphasis that the Rambam did, that this was a bracha levatala, and he didn't hold of the whole Shivata tradition. The question is, what did the early Chazanim themselves, like the Elazar Kalir and Yanai, hold? Did they hold it was a chovah? They clearly held that you could say Shemu Malchut when they composed it. So the earliest history of Arvit and its obligatory nature is shrouded in a murky mystery. But by the time we finish the era of the Rishonim, and especially the Achronim, we find absolutely no one who is praying Arvit with a Chazarat HaShatz, even with a Shivata. We just don't find Shivatot ever said for Arvit after the 13th century, to my knowledge. So with that, we're beginning Arvit here. And with that, we're concluding our survey of the early history of Arvit. To summarize, let me see if we have time. They're about to start, but to summarize, there's Machloket Tanaim, whether it's Arvit or whether Arvit was a reshut or a chovah. Over time, it became accepted as a reshut, but we should treat it as if it's a chovah, and we took over certain practices from it, but not certain important ones like Chazarat HaShatz or Kedusha. We don't treat it completely like a chovah, but we treat it like a reshut in some regards. And this compromise stays with us to this day. Thank you for your time and attention. And we will continue by Hashem with the Bracha V'Hamariv Aravim next week.